people who challenge us with their pain and hurt, the people who challenge us and tell us that all of the abuse didn't happen in the Catholic Church. Some of it happened in the Baptist Church too. Those people we simply will not hear. Those people we simply will not hear. Not Deacon so-and-so. It couldn't have been. I knew him. I know him. He and my family are friends. It couldn't possibly have been him. I never saw him do anything like that. He's always been good in my presence. We sound just like the people who write letters on Kavanaugh's behalf. There are some stories we are unwilling to hear. What I know from the Senate hearings, what I know from our own internal strivings, it is often the case that the stories we know to be true are the ones that we dispute the loudest. They are the ones that we holler no before they can get out of the mouth of the person who experienced it. We won't hear them, not because we disbelieve them, but because we know they're true. Some stories we are unwilling to hear. Some stories we are unwilling to hear because we know what frat boy culture is like. We know what church boy culture is like. We know what it's like our own selves. And so while there are some stories that we are unwilling to hear, there are also some stories we are unwilling to tell. Yes, sometimes we don't tell the story true because we are caught like Kavanaugh. We tell stories that strain credulity. We make up definitions to words that anybody their age already knows what they mean. We say over and over again with a gleam in our eye that we like beer, but we've never been drunk. And not only have we never been drunk, we don't actually know how many beers it takes to get drunk. Sometimes, follow me here, I'm on my way somewhere. Some stories we are unwilling to hear, and some stories we are unwilling to tell. The stories we are unwilling to tell, we sometimes are unwilling to be honest about because they cast us in an unfavorable light. We are so busy, all of us, not just the Republicans. We are so busy, all of us, not just white America. We are so busy, not just church folks. We are all so busy relying on our own goodness and righteousness that we find it difficult to admit not only that we're mistaken now, but that we ever made a mistake. It was never me. We get in the church and forget about who we ever were. Forget that there are people in the neighborhood who knew us then and can testify about what they saw in us, what they heard us say, and what they saw us do. And rather than just falling on the mercy of God and telling the truth about the things that we have done, we decide that it is better to put up a false facade and pretend like we don't even know the person that we were. Some stories we're unwilling to hear, some stories we are unwilling to tell because they cast us in an unfavorable light. But more than that, there are some stories we are unwilling to tell because they reveal our vulnerability. The thing that happened all over the nation last week as we watched Christine Blasey Ford tell her story is that more and more of us felt like we ought to tell our stories. There was something about the vulnerability of that woman on the screen that made it feel like it might be an open door. This might be the right season. There's not much that we have in common with Christine Blasey Ford. Most of us don't have her money. Most of us don't have her education. Most of us did not grow up in communities like the one in which she grew up. But there was something about the vulnerability that she displayed as she told the truth of her life that drew out the pain of our own lives. If you were like me as you watched that story and found yourself yourself shaking, you began to go back through the Rolodex of your own memory to figure out why it was that this particular narrative was so affecting. And in spite of the fact that these stories that we could tell if we had a moment reveal our vulnerability, we are realizing the Me Too movement is all about the realization that we are more powerful when we tell the story true. We are more powerful and stronger when we admit to ourselves what has happened to us and admit to other people what has happened to us. And there are some stories that it is difficult, maybe impossible to hear. There are some stories that it is difficult, sometimes impossible to tell. And yet, as Christian believers, the notion of testimony is central. It is core to our very identity as the people of God. There is no way for us to be believers if people won't tell their story. There is no way for us to know what's true, not only about their story, but about the God who enters the world through their story. There is no way for us to know what's true about not only them, but God if they will not tell. Imagine what we would be if Mary, the mother of Jesus, had simply been too afraid to tell it true. What would we have been if she had simply been too afraid, if rather than telling the story as she experienced it, unbelievable as it was, if she had decided that she would just skip all of the intermediaries and jump off a cliff on her own rather than wait for stoning? Where would we be in salvation history if Mary didn't tell her story? Where would we be if John the Baptist had been too afraid of Herod to tell what God had called him to do? Where would we be if he had not cried loud and spared not, even to the point of death and demise? Just because it was dangerous and risky, he did not stop. Just because there were those who did not believe him, he did not stop. Indeed, the prophet Isaiah says, "Who has believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" It's always a danger when we tell the story, when we tell our story. When I tell my story, there's always a danger that we will not be believed, and yet we tell it, and we depend upon the telling of stories in order to know the God about whom they talk. Indeed, Jesus' own witness is central to the notion of the Gospel of John. He says over and over again that he is bearing witness and that his witness is true. And you will know the truth, and the truth, God help me tonight, you will know the truth. You will know the true story, and the true story will make you free. Not the easy story, not the convenient story, not the story that's most plausible, not the story that keeps you comfortable, but you will know the true story, and the true story will make you free. Don't you see, God help me tonight, that what is at stake in the telling of our stories, what is at stake in the telling of the story, what is at stake in the telling of truth is the freedom that God calls us to, the life that God calls us to. We cannot know life without light, and we cannot have light without truth. We've got to tell the story true. And so as the Gospel of John is about to make its turn towards the events that we know as Passion Week, we get another opportunity to witness somebody being a witness. What we have here in the Gospel of John is an witness. We have somebody whose very eyes bore witness to what was true. We have somebody who was known in the community as the man who was born blind. Somebody not who had lost his vision progressively over time, not somebody who had contracted an illness or a disease that had robbed him of his sight, but somebody who had never seen before. Then as now, it is easier to imagine the restoration of sight than the granting of sight to someone who has never seen. Easier to imagine a cure for somebody who used to be able than it is to imagine that God can do something with somebody who was never able. Easier then as now to imagine a change, God help me, in circumstance for somebody who used to be on the top and now has fallen on hard times than it is for somebody who started on the bottom and has never been up. We've got right here an eyewitness to the power of the living Christ, and even the disciples are unready for it. Text says, I love this part of the text. The text says, there are some assumptions that the disciples are making that are about to be challenged by the work of God in their midst. There are some assumptions, I said, that the disciples, some conclusions that the disciples have already drawn that are about to be challenged by the working and the glory of God in their midst. They've been walking with Jesus this long a time, and they are still making assumptions. They still know every blessed thing. They still are already the theological geniuses who have everything already under control. They just have a few little questions. They're asking God for just a few details to complete the picture of God and the world that they have already drawn. And so they said, we know already that it must have been somebody who sinned that this man was born blind. We just asking you, was it his parents who sinned before he was born, or was it him who sinned before he was born? I mean, who was it? We know somebody. The insight I am having in this very moment is that sometimes before the miracle even happens, the people who are closest to Jesus have to have a reorientation of their perspective. Even before the miracle happens, even before the glory falls, even before things turn around, sometimes God has to check us and our assumptions. Sometimes the work that God wants to do doesn't happen on Sunday morning or in a revival when all the people come. Sometimes the work that God has to do happens in Bible study when we're up close and personal with Jesus, or in our time of prayer when we're asking God the things that we won't say in public. Who is it who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said, none of the above. This man's condition exists so that God can get glory. Everybody's condition exists so that God can get glory. If you can see, your condition exists so that God can be glorified. And if you can't see, your condition exists so that God can be glorified. Wherever you find yourself, whatever state you are in, whether you showed up like this in the world or whether you became like this over time, whether this is something that you count as a benefit, it's for God's glory. If it's something that you count as a deficit, it's for God's glory. However it is we show up in the world, it is so that God can get the glory out of our lives. Not just our oppression, but also our freedom. Not just the things that are difficult, but also our joys. God is looking for some folks who will give glory to God in whatever condition we find ourselves. Not just the man's blindness, but also his seeing. Not just what you're going through now that's difficult, but when you get on the other side of it and things are going well, that too is for God's glory. It's all for God's glory. And Jesus then begins to engage no longer his disciples, but the man himself. And not his parents nor this man are responsible for the condition that he's in. He is in the spot he's in so that God can get the glory. He said, I must work the works of the one who sent me while it is day, because the night is coming. Or what Jesus is saying, and the condition that I'm in right now is also for God's glory. I recognize myself right now in the place where I am in order for God to be glorified. You must work the works of the one who sent you, not in times going forward, but right now. We got to preach in season and out of season. We got to serve in season and out of seasons, and tight is coming when no one can work. And so Jesus then spat on the ground. This is not my favorite part of the text, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Because I want us to be instructed about what it is that we are called to do. Jesus has his own way of accomplishing his purposes. And it is not always the case that the ways that Jesus chooses to accomplish his purposes are pleasant for us in the happening. It doesn't always sound good when you tell how Jesus brought you through. It ain't always pleasant when you explain how Jesus brought you through. And I am sure that it is possible that if he'd asked the man ahead of time, can I spit on the ground and then put the spit on your eye, that the man might have thought something different about this project. Spat on the ground, made mud with saliva, smeared the mud. I don't know how. I love the details the text doesn't give us. I love the details the text doesn't give us. Like, how do you walk up to a man, spit on the ground, and just rub stuff on his eyes? Even if you are blind, you can move. But what I do want you to see is that the text does not end there and the healing is not completed there. So on the one hand, Jesus is the one who spits on the ground and forms, it would seem, some brand new eyes for the man whose eyes don't work. But then Jesus says, if you want to actually experience the fullness of your healing, you've got to go. You got to go and wash not just in any old pool. You got to wash in the pool that every time you remember it, you remember that you got there because you were sent. You were. This is the thing that caused me to shout when I was in the car. The thing that made me happy is that Jesus does not put the results in the man's hands except to send him. And I am so glad right now as a pastor that Jesus does not put the results in my hands, and that Jesus does not put the results in your hands, and Jesus does not put the results in St. Paul's hands. What Jesus does say is go find yourself in the place where you were. I wish you'd go where I send you. I wish you'd wash where I send you. I wish you'd remember in your testimony every time you tell the story that it only happened because he sent. It doesn't matter what's in the water. I was sent. Doesn't matter whether it's a hospitable place. I got here because I was sent. Doesn't matter. None of those things matter. Go wash in the place where you were sent. It might have been a terrible pond that he found himself in. But when he went in those waters, he went there not because they were healing waters, but because he was. I tell you what I know. after 9 years of pastoring in one place, I know for a fact that being sent somewhere makes all the difference. I appreciated when I started that I was called by the saints at St. Paul's. But there are days and there have been weeks and sometimes even months where the only way I could comfort myself where I was by remembering that I got there not because I was called, but because I was. The thing I'm learning in the context of our ministries is that too often we have been electing people who are not sent. We have been appointing people who are not sent. We have been positioning people who are not sent, and they do all right while things are good. But when they begin to tell their story, if they are missing this critical element of having been sent by the man called Jesus, they cannot stay where I put them. They can only stay where Jesus sent them. And the beauty of the story is that the hospitality of the pool is irrelevant when you're sent. Because when you go where you're sent, no matter what's in the water, you get healed. When you go where you're sent, you find yourself strengthened in places that are inhospitable to your kind. You find yourself well in places that are disastrous to other people who have not been sent. When you are sent and you go, then you are healed. You can only see if you go where you're sent. You can only be renewed if you go where you're sent. You can only be revived if you go where you're sent. He goes where he's sent, and not by the power of the waters of Siloam, but the power of the one who sent him in the first place. He goes and dips himself in that water, and he comes up doing something he has never done before. He comes up doing something he never imagined himself ever being able to do. He comes up seeing. He comes up seeing. So there this guy is. Y'all see the picture, right? There this man is. He has been blind the whole time. He's been blind for his entire ever. He encounters Jesus. Jesus touches him. Jesus sends him. And he comes back healed. He's got a story to tell. He doesn't take out an ad in the newspaper. He does not create a creative marketing plan. He just goes back to the place where people knew him blind. He goes back to the place where he has corroborating witnesses who have experienced him both as broken